The Quran makes reference to other pre-Islamic Arab civilizations, and in its usual dismissive, derisive, and condescending tone talks about their destruction. For example, in several places without giving any context or order, or explaining who they actually were or how long ago they lived, it mentions a people called the Thamud, who were destroyed by Allah. It is probably for good reason it does not contain too much information, because the little bit of cursory information it gives about them is all wrong, such as how they carved rocks to make houses out of them, that a prophet called Saleh came to warn them about their polytheistic practices. They appear as part of a moralistic lesson about Allah's destruction of sinful nations. In order to understand a little bit more about them, commentaries need to be looked at. For Quran 7:73, it explains the people of Thamud demanded Saleh show them a miracle proving he was a prophet from God. The miracle they wanted him to perform was to be able to produce a living camel from a rock. Allah granted this to happen, yet the Thamud ended killing the camel, for which they were punished. Although many prophetic stories in the Quran are taken from the Bible, the story of Saleh, who came to a people called Thamud, along with the unusual story of a live camel made from a rock, is not one of them. In this source called Arabs, a 3,000-year history of peoples, it mentions the story of Thamud is found in pre-Islamic ancient Arabian poetry as a metaphor for the transience of all things. Unsurprisingly, dare it be said, but rather facetiously, it is a miracle in itself as to how some Muslims have made the story of a living camel being made from a rock as another one of those dubious Quranic scientific miracle claims. Apparently, the story is in conformity with modern science. As the details about Thamud in the Quran are sketchy and rather scant, the secondary source of Islamic text, the Hadith literature, does not contain much other than they lived in modern-day Saudi Arabia in a place called Hijr, that Muhammad and the Muslims used to pass by their habitations, who would advise them to pass by it swiftly without going into them, lest the same punishment befalls them also. Please note quite clearly the Hadith mentions the name Thamud as the people who lived in a place called Hijr, the very same people who made houses out of rocks to live in. These are important points to remember, as it will become clear shortly. To get more information about Thamud, one cannot turn to the Quran or Hadith. Instead, external, historical, and archaeological sources need to be looked at. One of the earliest is in the Assyrian sources during the time of Sargon II, who reigned during the 8th century BC. The word Thamud appears inscribed at Dur Sharrukin. They seem to have been a very early tribal confederation in the northwestern region of the Arabian Peninsula. The name Thamud is also attested in later Greek and Roman sources. More information on this is provided in the book Arabia and the Arabs. The aforementioned dates are important because the Quran, Muhammad, and by extension, Muslims believed the Thamud were a people who dwelt in northern Saudi Arabia called Hijr, and they were the ones who had built houses carved from rock. However, the houses that are being referred to in the Quran and Hadith were not built by the Thamud, but by a separate, distinct Arabian group called the Nabateans, who were mentioned in the previous video. Nor Were they actual dwelling places for them to feel secure, as the Quran implies? Rather, they were tombs which were built during the 1st century AD. The area was known to the ancient Greeks as Hegra, which came to be known to later Arabs as Al-Hijr. They also called it Madain Saleh, which means cities of Saleh. Today it is an archaeological site located within the Medina province in Saudi Arabia. In 2008, UNESCO proclaimed the area as Saudi Arabia's first World Heritage Site. Here on the left, in a website called About Islam, it seeks to clarify the difference between the Thamud and the Nabateans because they are often confused as one of the same people. It says the people of Thamud were from the 4th century BC or possibly earlier, and the Nabateans came later, so quite clearly implying they are different and not the same people. Due to the conflation of Thamud and Nabateans, other Islamic sources, such as this one on the right called Sacred Footsteps, admits there is confusion, so uses the usual apologetics to say the Nabateans were not the only people to carve dwellings from rock, although no such evidence is provided to the contrary other than vacuous claims. Notice in the Hadith it quite clearly said it was the Thamud who built the rock buildings. In other Islamic websites, such as the Muslim Times, it says Thamud and Nabateans were the same people. Notice this is not because of the already cited evidence from historians and archaeologists, but because the Quran talks about an ancient people called the Thamud who built dwellings from rocks in Hijr, making people think, especially Muslims, just as Muhammad did, that the Thamud built these buildings. A trend common amongst Islamic apologetics is solipsism. Truth or reality is not truth or reality unless it conforms with the Quran and Hadith, even if evidence is shown to the contrary. Just as the idiomatic expression goes, square peg in a round hole, they have to still try and fit it in with the religion somehow. Even if solipsistic apologists try to embark on this futile course by claiming the two groups are one and the same. The Arabs during Muhammad's time had different names for the Thamud and the Nabateans. Here is a hadith showing that Muhammad called the Nabateans Al-Anbat. He never once described Nabateans as the Thamud, because for him they no longer existed at his time because, according to the Quran, they were destroyed. In other words, a distinction was made for the two groups of people. It may perhaps be that Muhammad and his contemporaries did not believe the Nabateans were the ones who built the carvings, so they never made that connection, falsely believing, as they did, that it was the Thamud who built them many, many years ago. Thus, for any apologists who claim they are actually the same people as this source, that argument fails too. Another major historical error in the Quran in relation to the Thamud is that the Quran says the Thamud had already been destroyed before the time of Moses. This is referenced in Quran 40 verses 26 to 31. Moses' time is estimated to be between the 14th to 13th century BC, and the Quranic account talks about their destruction before this time. So that puts Thamud as existing at least before the 14th century BC. That is over hundreds of years before their supposed existence, at least archaeologically and historically. So not only does the Quran and Hadith conflate the rock dwellings to be thousands of years old, when they were only around 600 years old at the time of Muhammad, the entire timeline and chronology in connection to the Thamud, not least the people who built it and its purpose, is all wrong. So in conclusion, the Quran conflates the Thamud with the Nabateans. However, these two groups were distinct people. The Thamud came much earlier and were not responsible for the carved dwellings that are found in Hijr, as the Quran and Hadith imply. Rather, this was done by the Nabateans. Further, the buildings are tombs, not houses or dwellings. The story of Saleh, the miracle of a camel coming from a rock, and Thamud being destroyed by Allah are not found anywhere other than in pre-Islamic myths, legends, and poetry. Therefore, it is likely Muhammad accepted these accounts without fact-checking them. If he was a genuine prophet, these errors would never have occurred. Muslims, of course, will still try and find a way to argue it using solipsism. They have to try and make it work, and for them there is still no contradiction. In reality, this is only their statement power and confirmation bias. For them, whatever happens, their statement stands as true because it has to conform with the Quran and Hadith. It's in this simplicity wherein lies its flaws, a cognitive dissonance driven to promote harmony and coherence for their beliefs, in that they are correct because they say it is correct, regardless of what the actual evidence is.